Al-Farabi and the Otrar Library. Philosophical texts, medical treatises, articles on history, mathematics, psychology, and works of fiction. A collection of 7 million books. And what of the index system? Here they have physical records, and here the digital ones. In a matter of minutes, any query will return dozens or even hundreds of answers. Moments later, and the book we seek is in our hands. The great scientist Abu Nasr Al-Farabi could only dream of such a library. However, today, the dream of all scientists would be to find a book depository founded by him personally. Ancient chronicles unanimously assert that over the centuries, thousands and thousands of books from around the world, Kipchak chronicles, Arabic dastans, books written on white shagreen skin, Muslim inzhalis, the Gospel of Christians, were collected at the Otrar Library, Dukenbai Doszhanov, Vladimir Malov, Hills of Otrar. But where are the priceless manuscripts stored? Could the great philosopher himself have founded the Otrar Library when he left his native land? Why was the Otrar Library named as second only to the library at Alexandria? It has been argued that there was a very large and reputable library in Otrar. What do the medieval chronicles hide?
I have seen manuscripts of Al-Farabi. That's, of course, it was later copies, but it's extraordinary.
Where are the handwritten artifacts hidden? The discovery of America is nothing compared to the knowledge that is buried in the Otrar Library. Priceless treatises, a gateway to the Middle Ages and the guardian of literary secrets, chronicles of legendary events, Al-Farabi and the Otrar Library. Chapter 1. Between Fantasy and Reality. Small filing cabinets with deep drawers are an indispensable part of any library. Everything is ordered alphabetically, but also by topic or theme, or by origin. It's not easy to list everything, but the priority, the ideal system, is one that allows any visitor to the National Library to find any book they need. The chief chronicler of the Khan's court, Amit Baba, read a long list. The Kipchak chronicle wrapped in sheepskin is 75 skeins, Indian books decorated with fish scales, 3,200 bales of papyrus scrolls, 90 Babylonian plates with sacred words. Dukenbai Doszhanov, Vladimir Malov, Hills of Otrar. There were around 33,000 books and manuscripts in total. An entire building with fountains and a garden was especially allocated to house these priceless documents. This is how one might imagine it to be. Such details are not mentioned in the written sources. It is something of a scientific myth because you won't find the concept of the Otrar Library in any historical chronicle or source. It is a fairly modern myth, and yet, in fairness, medieval book depositories did look like this. For example, the Arab geographer Al-Muqaddasi also writes about the libraries of Iran. The buildings were surrounded by gardens with lakes and canals, crowned with domes, and consisted of upper and lower floors. In each room the catalogues were kept on shelves, and the floors were carpeted. A city with large buildings made from burnt adobe bricks. It evolved into a hub on this great trade route. A typical metropolis on the Great Silk Road. Streets paved with brick, lit by night. Neighborhoods with a maximum of 15 adobe houses each. This city was almost as close to him as Visige. It is not known exactly where the house of Al-Farabi was located. By that time, Otrar was flourishing. Caravan routes converged in the city, and it had everything. The Rabat, where the artisans lived, was connected by underground tunnels to the Shahristan, the city centre protected by fortified walls. There were shops with goods to suit every taste, as well as caravanserais, guest houses, public baths, and other public institutions. Whether there were libraries or not is a difficult question, because there were literate people who could read. But whether they gathered in dedicated libraries, I do not know. It's very difficult to answer. Perhaps some people kept certain books. Of course, there were specialists in certain areas of science and culture where the presence of books would have been necessary. There were such specialists. Otrar in the days of Al-Farabi, at the very peak of the cultural renaissance, like other major cities at the crossroads of the Silk Road. The Silk Road naturally played an enormous role in the formation of urban culture, or urbanization as this process is called, where certain small settlements grow into cities that then become famous centers. Dozens of libraries in Merv, a whole palace of manuscripts in Shiraz. There are even references to a traveling collection of manuscripts. One Baghdad caliph was followed by a caravan of books. At any moment, the ruler could be provided with the necessary volume. The camels carried the precious cargo in alphabetical order. One of the richest book depositories was considered to be the depository at Bukhara. In each room there were chests of books placed one on top of the other. I saw books there, the names of which many have never heard of, and I myself have not seen them either before or since. I read those books, learned all the useful things that were in them, and recognized the degree of scholarship of each author. Abu Ali ibn Sina, Biography and Works. Incidentally, the story of this literary boom began in southern Kazakhstan, the year 751 AD. The legendary Battle of Otrar. The troops of the Abbasid Empire and the Karluk Khaganate fought against the Tang Chinese army for control of Central Asia. Due to the fact that the Arab forces stood firm, history took a completely different path, and the influence of the Arabicized East on our culture is more powerful. It was here, on the banks of the Talas River, that the secret of papermaking was revealed when two Chinese craftsmen were captured. Still a mystery to Europeans, paper had long replaced parchment and papyrus in the East, and it now began to be used everywhere. Moreover, the Central Asian cotton version of paper became the most popular. In Uzbekistan, Samarkand has now resumed the creation of Samarkand paper according to ancient methods. We now have Central Asian paper produced in Samarkand. This paper, which, unlike imported parchment, was practical and inexpensive, became the driving force of cultural progress. Hundreds of libraries appeared, and books became widely available to the public. It is reasonable to assume that a public reading room was also opened in Otrar. A library must have existed in Otrar. It is often referred to as second only to the library at Alexandria. This most famous library of antiquity housed a collection that amounted to around 500,000 manuscripts. There are accounts that suggest almost as many manuscripts were kept in Otrar. For comparison, in the same historical period, in the Cordoba Caliphate in Spain, the book depositories contained about 2 million books. Each city had its own specialization, its own specifics, its own image. Otrar was the center of scientific thought. There were a huge number of spiritual leaders and scientists who had both reputation and celebrity. That is, those for whom books were of paramount importance. So the presence of a library in Otrar is difficult to dispute. Was the famous scientist its founder? How did Aristotle change his life? And why was Al-Farabi called the second teacher? Chapter 2. Gateway to the Middle Ages. The National Library of Kazakhstan. Here, they work in half-light. Sunlight is counterproductive for the inhabitants of these halls, which are kept silent and cool. 60% humidity is a must for books made of leather and bound with parchment. Volume after volume, story after story, one of the most mysterious is the legend of the creator of the Otrar library. Allegedly, the foundations of the book depository in the glorious city of Otrar were laid by the great scientist Al-Farabi. To be literate, to know the languages of Arabs, Persians and Greeks, or the language of the Jews, is all very well, but to read, a Muslim should know only one holy, heavenly book, the Quran. Abu Nasr does not spend time somewhere among the slave beauties, nor surrounded by his father's warriors, but in the repository of ancient manuscripts. Anwar Alimjanov, Return of the Teacher. He did not leave anything behind about his life. There is no biography of the great teacher in the work of his students. Only briefly, in the manuscripts of Farabi himself, do facts appear that open the veil of secrecy.
I have seen manuscripts of Al-Farabi. That's, of course, it was later copies. But it's extraordinary to see how this man, in very old time, was erudite.
Oriental manuscript specialist and former director of the Islamic art department of the Louvre, Professor Richard is one of the few experts who can determine both the time and the place that a medieval document was written.
But I never had the chance to find a very, very old manuscript of Al-Farabi.
How many more public and private libraries in the world store undiscovered Islamic manuscripts in their vaults?
In the past, it was more common manuscripts used in the madrasa or the manuscripts kept in our families.
Are there any unknown works by Al-Farabi among them? Works that might hint at something from his biography? According to the information available, the life of the philosopher can be divided into two periods. The first, and most mysterious, from his birth to age 50. Allegedly, throughout this time, he lived in his native land and held an honorable position. The sources mention that, before his fascination with the sciences, Farabi was a judge, but having decided to devote himself to the search for truth, he quit this position, taking up secular affairs, in particular teaching. Muzaffar Khairulayev, Abu Nasr Al-Farabi. They say this happened after one of his friends gave Abu Nasr several treatises of Aristotle for safekeeping. Farabi began to read these books in his spare time and became so obsessed with them that he stepped down from his position. First and foremost, we can say that he took his first steps into science in Otrar. Most likely, he read in Arabic. The works of the Greek philosopher were very popular. He read not only once. On the Soul, he read 100 times. Natural Harmony, 40 times. Rhetoric, 200 times. That's what the legends say. Page after page, ignoring any noise outside the window, the cries of water carriers, an exciting bargain to be had. Sometimes whole performances were played out with the changing of the guard at the walls of the fortress. There were guard rooms on the sides of the city gate. Through them, one could climb up to the observation towers and see how, below the city gates, they would sell delicious cakes in tandoor shops. Quickly snacking on a cake, an enthusiastic reader hurries after a new treatise. Or is it a venerable librarian going around shops to replenish a collection of books? He was not the founder of the library. When Al-Farabi was born, there was already a large library. He often went there, used the books, and learned a lot back in Otrar. It should be noted that, along with the book depositories, most of the familiar regulations existed. For example, library membership. In the Middle Ages, books could also be taken home. It was, however, forbidden to write on the pages, or to hold the books by hand for any length of time. Perhaps a reader's guide to Al-Farabi has been preserved somewhere. It is believed that there was a large, reputable library in Otrar, where there were geographical works on history, philosophical treatises, and theology. In the realm of books, Abu Nasr lingered longer and longer. According to the rules, regular readers of the medieval Arab library could receive stationery and paper for free, along with the journals. And now, thoughts took wing and flew from these pages like birds. Abna, referring to the work of an author from the 15th century, notes that Farabi, whilst in his homeland, wrote the work Second Doctrine. The nickname Second Teacher, after Aristotle, is associated with this particular case. Ibn Sina studied the problems of philosophy. Similar information is contained in an earlier source, from the collection The Return of the Teacher, on the life and work of Farabi. Why do we consider Aristotle to be the first teacher? Because Al-Farabi said that he was his teacher, and that's why we call Al-Farabi the second teacher. Ibn Sina, aka Avicenna, subsequently wrote that he came to understand Aristotle only through the writings of Al-Farabi, the insight of the genius scattered across the many libraries of the East. Perhaps a copy was kept in his native Otrar, and even if he was not the founder of Otrar Library, he laid the foundations for things of greater importance. Where are the scientists' tracts found? How many namesakes were there? And what happened to the library? Chapter 3. A popular surname. The coldest and windiest place in all of Spain, town of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, and its main attraction. A monotonous symphony in stone, an architectural nightmare. This is the name of this palace. Well, Philip II of Spain himself intended to build no more, no less than a royal shack when he said, "I want to build a palace for God and a shack for the king." Housing the world's largest collection of Arabic manuscripts, the Escorial Library is second only to the Vatican Book Depository. The library was opened in the 16th century. I researched there for 11 days and I found 10 treatises on Abu Nasr Al-Farabi. They are written on parchment. It's easy to answer the question how the works of the Otrar thinker ended up in faraway Spain. Historical sources indicate that the local caliph, almost a contemporary of Al-Farabi, had a stronger passion for books than for the throne, and naturally he could not miss the treatises of the famous philosopher. Arabs conquered Spain in 711 AD. Arab culture existed steadily in Spain until the very end of 1492. Another interesting fact is that during years of research, it was found that more than one scientist with the same last name was noted in the world of science and literature. Nisba, this is a surname of some kind. Here, let's say, where were you born? In Almaty? You can write Nadia Almaty, for example. The system of names and patronyms was not yet developed back then. There were many Farabs. Therefore, there were many scientists who were based in Farab, that is to say, Farabians. We knew of only one Al-Farabi. Now, according to my research, according to my studies of Al-Farabi, I found 30 scientists from the city of Farab. There may have been some confusion, and the founder of the Otrar library really was Al-Farabi, just not the most famous one. Or perhaps it was because of the large number of namesakes in the biography of the great scientist that there were discrepancies. How can we discover exactly when he left his father's house if all the namesakes also went on journeys? Why did they leave for other countries? Because it's not easy to stay there and gain knowledge. No, of course, obviously, they reached a certain level of knowledge in their native city, and then they went to share and expand their knowledge further. They left for many cities in the Near and Middle East, for example to Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, Baghdad, Basra, and so on and so forth. There is speculation that the second teacher once returned to Otrar. In the years that have passed since Abu Nasr left Otrar, there were no significant changes in the life of the city. The scientist stayed there a short time, but managed to see both the old and the new quarters. Through the dirty labyrinths of narrow streets, he barely made his way to the mosque, which was familiar to him from his childhood years. And, passing through the courtyard, he went to the book depository. Anwar al-Imjanov, The Return of the Teacher. According to the literary version, the Otrar library was closed. There are no references to it at all in documented sources. But, according to legend, the book depository continued to successfully increase both its collections and its readers until the 13th century. September of 1219. The death of Otrar. Today, we lean more and more towards the idea that the Otrar library burned down, but there is no evidence that it did. This reading room contains all his treatises and all the works about him, about the philosopher, musician, mathematician, and regular visitor to the legendary Otrar library. Did it really perish during the siege of the city? How did they save the Otrar library? What do archaeologists say? And where are the priceless books hidden? Epilogue. Mysterious Book Depository. Surely the work of the famous philosopher in the Otrar library was treated with special care and no expense was spared. At that time, a copy of a valuable book was literally worth its weight in gold. Some treatises were valued more than a herd of horses. How could the governor of the city let such treasures perish? Otrar library was one of the largest in the world, but as a frontier city that stood at the front line, Otrar suffered greatly. They say that one of the guardians of the books foresaw the events and persuaded the ruler of Otrar to transfer the library to secret shelters under the city. The siege lasted 6 months, and there would have been enough time to hide them. The steep steps went into the dungeon. At the very entrance, the ceiling was very low, but further, in the depths, it was raised, and only by lifting the lamp could you see its stone arches. The air was heavy and moist, but one could sense that the tunnel was linked to the surface above by invisible vents. Dukenbai Doszhanov, Vladimir Malov, Hills of Otrar. One account says that to this day, unique book collections are kept in these secret underground shelters. There is some anecdotal evidence, but it's very difficult to find. Preservation of parchment and paper is unfortunately difficult, and much of it burned in the conflagration, or may have been buried in some hidden structures. They may yet be found amongst other underground treasures.
Скрытых сооружениях теперь, в каких-то кладах могут обнаружиться.
The discovery of America is nothing compared to the knowledge that is buried in the Otrar library. Perhaps, even now, buried under the dust of centuries. Annals are waiting in the wings. How much could they tell of that time, the time of the great scientist and philosopher, Al-Farabi?